Thank you all for being here at today's event sponsored by the Center for Politics and the People. I'm Henrik Schatzinger, interim director of the center, and I'm also a professor of political science. These events are made special because of your attendance and participations. And to those of you who are visiting us, thank you and welcome to Ripon College. Today we are fortunate to welcome Professor Katherine Cramer from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who is a political science professor and the Natalie C. Holton Chair of Letters and Science at UW-Madison. In 2016, she published the book, The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness in Wisconsin and the Rise of Scott Walker, published by the University of Chicago Press. It brought to light rural resentment towards cities and its implications for contemporary politics, and it has been a go-to source for understanding rural public opinion. In the book, Cramer questions how the very people who stand to benefit from strong government services not only vote against the candidates who support those services, but are vehemently against the very idea of big government. She uncovers an oft-overlooked piece of the puzzle, rural political consciousness, and the resentment of the quote-unquote liberal elite. Rural voters are distrustful that politicians will respect the distinct values of their communities and allocate a fair share of resources. What can look like disagreements about basic political principles are therefore actually rooted in something even more fundamental: who we are as people and how closely a candidate's social identity matches our own. Today, we will engage in a conversation to re-examine rural political consciousness and to see what has and has not changed since the book was published. Dr. Cramer received her bachelor's degrees from the UW-Madison in 1994 and her PhD from the University of Michigan in 2000. She's also an affiliate, a faculty member in the UW-Madison Elections Research Center, the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, the La Follette School of Public Affairs, the Institute for Research and Poverty, the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies, the Wisconsin Center for the Advancement of Post-Secondary Education, and the Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems. Her work focuses on the way people make sense of politics and their place in it. She is known for her innovative approach to the study of public opinion, in which she uses methods like inviting herself into conversations with groups of people to listen to the way they understand public affairs. She's also the author of 2 other books, talking about race, community dialogues, and the politics of difference, and talking about politics, informal groups, and social identity in the American life. Both books were also published by the University of Chicago Press. So on a different note, I'm happy that we're able to make this conversation today happen, because it has been a long time coming. In fact, it is fair to say that it has been 6 years in the making. I first emailed Dr. Cramer 6 years ago, and she is a popular speaker, and she is also a busy scholar, but she is here today to share her take on rural consciousness. So please welcome Professor Dr. Katherine Cramer. So in terms of process, I will ask Dr. Cramer some questions for the next half an hour or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from you, the audience. So let's get started and talk a little bit about the early days when you were thinking about this book. Let's just sort of go back a little bit in time and think about, what did you want to find out? And in other words, what were your research questions that you wanted to tackle initially?
Okay. Thank you for having me, first of all, and thank you for your persistence. It is really a joy to be here, and you can call me Kathy. Everybody calls me Kathy. Yes, but when I earned tenure at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I designed the study I'd always wanted to do, which is study political understanding by driving around the state that I love and spending time with the people who live here. At that point in my career, I was really interested in the way social class matters for how we make sense of politics. The thing that has fascinated me throughout my career is how do people understand the world they're living in, and how do those understandings influence who they vote for, how they understand public issues from local to national level. And I had also understood at that point in my career that to study that kind of thing, how people are making sense of the world, it helps to listen to people, right? It helps to be with people, listening to them talk to people that they normally talk to in the places that they normally hang out. So what I did was to sample communities from around the state that varied in socioeconomic background. So I wanted some lower income communities, some upper income communities, and then I aimed to invite myself into conversations of regulars, people who got together on a regular basis in a place that I might just walk into and invite myself into their conversations. So I was not looking for a rural versus urban divide initially. You can probably tell from my accent, I've lived here some time, pretty much my whole life, but I grew up in Grafton, which is basically halfway between Milwaukee and Sheboygan, and naively didn't understand the kind of sentiments that I was about to encounter in our smaller communities. So when I sampled a variety of communities throughout the state, I asked a local newspaper editor or someone from the UW Extension Service, where in so-and-so Wisconsin do people get together on a regular basis that I might have access to, and I ended up spending time in gas stations and diners and places of worship, and literally just inviting myself in year after year to their conversations. So initially what I was looking for is how do people's sense of where they are in the pecking order of things, just in terms of class, status, their own economic background, how does that relate to their political thoughts, what they're expressing to their friends and family members?
Mm-hmm. And can you share a little bit more about your research methods? Political scientists are often known for looking for large data and a large number of cases and trying to use sort of fancy, mathematical or statistical methods to analyze that data. But your method is very different, right? You even have a chapter, it's entitled "The Method of Listening." Can you tell a bit more about where did you go to listen, and who did you listen to, and how did you choose who to listen to, and how did you analyze that information?
Sure, yeah. My method's not very fancy. I mean, it's me, my car, my ears, my recorder, Badger football schedules as incentives, sometimes pens and other things from UW-Madison. But basically what I did was to walk into a place, let's say it's at the gas station. Someone had told me, well, every morning at 5:30 there's a group of folks who get together near the back, walk to the back, they'll be near the coffee urns, and I'd walk in and I'd say, hi, I'm Kathy from University of Wisconsin-Madison. I study public opinion. Do you mind if I join you this morning? And they would usually chuckle, kind of give me a look of, really? And then I would just say, no, really, do you mind if I turn on these recorders, and here's my business cards, I'm not pulling your leg, and here's a Badger football schedule. Thank you so much for letting me sit down with you, and what are you all talking about these days? What are your concerns around here? And so I would try to, as much as possible, listen to what they then told me was important to them, what was going on in their community, what they were worried about, what they loved about their community. And then I also had a few more specific questions, issues that I really wanted to hear a conversation about, but as much as possible, I just tried to be quiet and listen to what people brought up, what they expressed to me. And so I did that in, I guess it was 39 different groups across 27 communities around the state between 2007 and 2012. And so I would go revisit folks and record the conversations, transcribe them, look back through the transcripts to try to look for patterns in what people were talking about. And as you recall, I wasn't looking for a rural versus urban divide, but as I started reflecting on what I was hearing, and sharing what I was hearing with people on my campus, it was pretty clear after about a year that what I was hearing in our smaller communities and more rural spaces in the state was new to me, distinctive, and I thought politically really important.
Yeah, and you mentioned you're looking for certain, patterns of what you have heard. And so can you talk a little bit more about that? You identified certainly areas of discontent. And so what specifically were these elements of discontent?
Yeah, so I just want to paint a picture for you to frame this. So to convey, this was not a project about how can these people be so stupid? No, seriously, I want to make that clear. I was not looking for reasons, why are people not voting for candidates who support bigger government when clearly they would benefit from it? It wasn't, that question instead was given to me when I explained what I was hearing in these smaller communities. And I've been asked that question many times. Sure, Kathy, fine, but what's wrong with these people, right? And so I want you to picture this, kind of the kindness that was given to me while I was visiting a variety of communities, and nevertheless what people were expressing to me. So remember, I'm walking in, I'm driving a Volkswagen Jetta around the state. I mean, I'm clearly, from Madison, a female social scientist. I'm walking in, cold call, interrupting people's conversations, and they're welcoming me in. And what I'm hearing time after time in our smaller communities and rural places is often being conveyed to me in jokes. So people would say things like, you all down in Madison, you think Highway 8 is up north, and if Highway 8 is up north, then what's Bayfield, right? Or you think Highway 29 is up north if it cuts through Wausau, right? If that's up north, what do you think is up there in Ashland? Like, you all in Madison have no conception of the geography of the state, right? Like, you think it's Madison and Milwaukee, and then what about the rest of us? So that was one thing. It was sort of a concern about attention, that candidates don't come visit us, you all don't come visit us, people don't pay attention to us, and yet all the regulations that affect our lives are made in other places, namely Madison and Milwaukee. But it was also about resources, partly about money. People would say things like, it seems to us all the good jobs are in Madison and Milwaukee. I mean, jobs with benefits, higher pay. Every time we come down to Madison for a WIAA playoff, right, whether it's wrestling or basketball, so have you, there's all kinds of cranes at that university. Where are you getting all that money, right? Or they would say things to me like, Kathy, so you're a public employee, your job is to drive around the state having coffee with people like us, right? Like, how is that hard work? How's that hard work? So it was partly about attention and partly about resources, but also partly about respect, because people would say, and again, they weren't being obnoxious to me or mean to me, but there was this kind of, just this low simmering feeling of not getting their fair share of respect. Because they would say things like, you all making those laws down in Madison, or you all teaching our kids at UW-Madison, you don't understand what life is like in a community like this. And you drive through as a tourist, and you think you get it, you think you understand, but you don't understand what our challenges are here, and you think we're uneducated and racist and sexist, and we deserve better. So it was just this overall feeling of not getting one's fair share, and about attention and resources and respect. But again, I want to convey that gently to say, at the same time, people love their communities, right? It's not as if it was resentment and yet not anger when I heard it. And it was still like a deep respect and pride in the place that they were living.
Yeah, and I think that summarizes it very well. You mentioned the feeling of being ignored, the resource concerns, and then just sort of not understanding maybe the rural values and the lifestyle and sort of the perceived disrespect. Maybe we can delve into, at least one or two of those a little bit as far as the resources are concerned. You have a chapter where you talk about, chapter 4 talks about the resources that go towards rural communities, where you seem to find some support for those concerns. Now, earlier this year, there was an interesting column in the New York Times by Paul Krugman, who kind of picked up on, on what you wrote, and he said these rural perceptions are largely wrong, especially, in fact, all of the perceptions are wrong, he said, but in terms of resources, he's pointing out that in terms of rural resources, there are farm subsidies, there are programs that support housing, utilities, businesses. We have a large number of senior citizens who receive Social Security and Medicare. We have rural Americans who are more likely to receive Medicaid and to also receive food stamps. And so he goes through a long list of things where he said, actually, it's not really quite accurate here. So, and then he also points out that rural America is poorer than urban America, and therefore pays less per person in federal taxes. So, how do you look at that? Is he, is he right? And if then the question becomes also what truly is fueling that kind of or these perceptions, or if you want to call it this resentment?
Well, I found that pretty dismissive. Because the fact is, most people are not economists. Most people don't see the charts of what the relationship is between per capita income and how much people are paying into the state dollar pot or the federal pot. But they do see businesses boarded up on their main streets. They do experience themselves or their family members or neighbors losing their jobs and factories closing, family farms, gradually disappearing. So it's one thing to say on paper they're wrong, right? But it's another to acknowledge what people are saying when they're saying our communities are challenged. There aren't jobs for our kids to stay here, to come back after college, or to stay here after high school and raise families. We don't have broadband, for example, to get education, or for our kids in school to be able to do their homework, or to start a business, or even if we have a farm, to be able to log into the internet and check prices, right? Like, there are very reasonable reasons people are saying the economies in rural Wisconsin and rural America face a unique set of challenges that columnists at the New York Times don't seem to listen to.
I want to get to this point of like what is fueling those impressions more, right?
I knew there was a second part.
And maybe I can just sort of add a little bit to that. In one of the chapters, I'm just quoting here, a sentence that kind of surprised me a little bit. It is likely that rural consciousness exists not because it is communicated via news media, but because we teach these things to each other. So that to me, and I know you did a little bit of research on like local newspapers and how they cover issues, and you didn't find much there, right? But at the same time, we also know, and when I moved to Wisconsin myself, my wife is from a farming background, and I realized that what they listened to on those combines, it was Rush Limbaugh and conservative talk radio, and that's a very different entire beast, so to speak, right? To wrestle with, and there's also, and when you think about how not only they, but also look at Fox News, which also is a source of influence, obviously. How to talk about cities. Cities are usually a place of disorder, a place of, in cases of crime. There's some, there's chaos in cities. It's sort of the overarching theme, I would say. And in fact, there's a book by one of the former Fox News editors, Chris Steyerwald. It's called Broken News: Why the Media Rage Machine Divides America and How to Fight Back. He says that there is sort of the temptation of rage revenue through slanted coverage that drives political division and it rewards outrageous conduct. So isn't that a strong contributor to rural resentment, even though you may have not found it in certain kinds of news outlets?
Yes. So the sentiments that I heard, they were both people, when I say people teach them to each other, they were sort of reinforcing messages about the city folks ignoring their concerns, not giving them the resources they need in order to thrive, and disrespecting them. And one way in which I often heard that were some misconceptions that I would hear about faculty members at UW-Madison. And mind you, they know who I am, right? But the number of times people ask me whether I actually work hard in a variety of ways was very eye-opening to me. I can come back to that because I learned a lot about the way people think about hard work and how those of us who have the luxury of not doing manual labor and wearing out our bodies by the time we retire, there's a lot to think about there. And yet, part of what I was writing about in that book was there are these sentiments, and that's part of what I call the politics of resentment. But then there are political forces that use them, whether you call that tapping into them or taking advantage of them, depends on your political perspective, I think. But for example, I mean, when I was doing my field work, Scott Walker ran for governor in 2010, and which I was not anticipating when I started my field work in 2007. But I'll just give one example issue that seemed to be one where Scott Walker said to people outside of the Milwaukee and Madison metro areas, I hear you, and I'm standing for you, and I'm going to argue on this particular issue to convey to you I'm on your side, which was the high-speed train between Madison and Milwaukee. So if you remember, the sitting governor at the time, Jim Doyle, had accepted $800 million in federal funds for this high-speed rail line to be built between the two main cities in the state, right? And Scott Walker said, if I'm elected, I'm not going to take that money, because it's not money that's going up to fix the such and such near Black River Falls or the road by La Crosse, or this is not, I'm paraphrasing somewhat, but this is nearly a direct quote from one of the debates during the gubernatorial campaign. And it was a kind of a clear way of signaling that money may help the metro areas in the state, but it's not going to help the rest of you. And I see it as an abuse of taxpayer funds. So that's just from politicians. But when you add in the media rage machine, what a great description for it, right? I mean, divisiveness sells on both sides of the political spectrum. It catches our attention, it provokes us, it causes us to click on things, to look in closer. It's very different than communicating a story about how, look at Ripon and how everyone's getting along in Ripon, Wisconsin, right? I mean, we might all pay attention, but it doesn't grab as much attention as the rage machine.
We get along unless you move a little white schoolhouse, then
I was wondering when that was going to come up.
But maybe you can just mention a little bit more about, you wrote how we teach these things to each other. So there must be some observations where you kind of see that sort of, oral communication between maybe generations and families values and so forth. Or what do you mean? What do you mean by
Well,
that?
even within these groups, right, the way people would talk about, I was down in Madison last week, and you should see, like, my son lives in Madison, and their garbage pickup, and the way, like, there's talking about the garbage pickup and the sewage infrastructure and economies of scale and how much better they have it down in the cities, whereas way up here in northern Wisconsin, how difficult it is for us to provide public services. And then other people in the group would sort of chime in and explain to others examples like that. That's just one way in which, in these, in our daily interactions, we say to each other who we are, what our community is like, and how it compares to other places, and how we compare to other people.
I have 3 more questions, and then we'll open it to the audience. The next 2 questions are really about the role of we can always point at the media, and we can point at Republicans, right, as a source, but also look at the Democrats, again, especially the society. For a moment, at this point, only 5% of Democratic U.S. House members represent rural districts. So, to what extent do you blame Democrats themselves for their rural demise? Some people point to 1992 as a watershed moment for Democrats when Bill Clinton moved the party in the direction of free trade and toward the economic center. And so the narrative here is that that this has left some Democratic voters in rural regions, especially where manufacturing is a big industry, high and dry, and that they felt disillusioned and shifted away from Democrats. And then with fewer economic differences between the parties, that really opened up the lane to highlight sort of the culture war issues, who were then able to become more dominant. And Democrats may have often ignored rural concerns and perspectives and sentiment. Do you buy into that theory?
Yes. It's pretty clear, and I don't know this for sure, but I think people who are activists in the state Democratic Party today would acknowledge that over the past few decades, the Democratic Party in Wisconsin, as in elsewhere, made a calculation that it was more efficient to focus their attention on more urban centers, because that's where a larger base of support for Democratic candidates, the Democratic Party was. It's actually easier to mobilize people in a more population-dense place. So it was a decision which, in the end didn't work out so well, because it turns out when you ignore communities, people feel it, they sense it somehow, and that is not a great way to build trust. Just parachuting in during elections is not a great way to convince people, I care about you, I care about your community, and trust me, give me your vote, and when I'm in there, I'll represent you, right? So I think just from a party organizing level, I do buy into that theory where there's been some neglect. And I think you're being, well, I should wait for your second quote, because I think you're being charitable. I mean, there are times, just as, I heard people from more conservative leanings saying things about people in the city that raise my hackles. I hear left-leaning people say things about people in rural communities that does as well, and is based on just a very, very little interaction and lack of understanding what life is like in these two, sometimes very different places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my second question also deals with sort of democratic, maybe, attitudes. Political scientist Justin Guest examines how societies respond to demographic changes and what the consequences are. He's an outspoken critic of how the Democratic Party has dealt with rural communities. He writes, and I'm going to give you a quote here, Democrats have effectively redlined rural America In some concerns of the corners of the Democratic Party, activists don't even want rural and white working class people in their coalition. They may even deride them. Rural and white working class Americans sense this. So, do you agree with or disagree with guests that some Democratic activists do indeed sort of look down upon rural and white working class people? And is there any, if that's true, is there any hope or any change maybe in sight going forward?
Well, I definitely hear those stories. I'm reluctant to say in general, that there's a condescension among Democratic activists. But my hope comes from the many people in our state and in our country who have grown up in one type of place and moved to the other, for example, or have bonds of family or friendships with people who live in a different type of place, and know at a human level that people in the other type of place are not evil, right? And they are also human beings and can connect on a human level before politics. Because if we only learn about each other through the media, whether it's social media or news media, the picture we're getting is not one that inspires much hope, right? But when I see people expressing concern about loved ones who live in a different type of space, when I see students in my classes from different backgrounds figuring it out with not a ton of work, how to talk with one another on a very human level about issues that they're both concerned about, it gives me hope. Like we can do this, we can be more understanding of one another. We do need to demand it of our political leaders as well, though, and that is a little bit trickier because lots of people, probably not you or all of us, just by virtue of you being here today, but lots of people have tuned out from politics, right? They're tired of the divisiveness, and it's the last thing they want to spend their energy on.
Let me ask a different sort of final question before we open it up, and that is more geared towards, then versus now. So if you kind of look back in terms of how has the political landscape maybe changed. Obviously, in your subtitle you have Scott Walker. Well, that's certainly changed. But in terms of more broadly speaking, how accurate are some of the are the findings, or do you think it's what you said maybe even more true than ever before? I just wonder what you think about when you started maybe 10 years ago or so versus where we are today. What are some of the differences and similarities?
Well, I do think I think the rural versus urban divide, and I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but because it looks different, sounds different in different parts of the country than here in the upper Midwest, but nevertheless, the 2016 presidential election was somewhat of a surprise to me, and I was not anticipating that Donald Trump would become president when I published this book. The academic publishing takes a long time, and the page proofs were in well before the campaign had really ramped up. But since 2016, there's been so much attention, right, to the political differences between rural communities and urban communities in the country. And I think that's fed the divide in a way. There's just been a ton of attention to it, and we've seen in recent elections or subsequent elections in Wisconsin even stronger support for Republican candidates in our more rural counties and stronger support for Democratic counties in our more metropolitan counties, except for this last Supreme Court election. That was a bit of an anomaly in that trend. So I learned that what I heard in Wisconsin was not unique to Wisconsin, and has the sentiments of kind of resenting cities and city folks among people in more rural communities has strengthened since I published that book.
Very good. I think with that, we have a foundation for questions from you, the audience, and anybody is welcome to ask. We love questions from students, of course, but let's start here in the front.
I have two questions, if you'll permit me.
Sure. Is that okay?
The first one is, you have been speaking as, it seems to me, as if you are messaging an urban audience. And I would like to know whether that's entirely true. I would like to know if, you have been talking about the rural people as they. And I would like to know if there are any we here that are rural. I'm not, but, I live in Ripon, but I'd just like to know that, if that's not too intrusive. And the second thing is, listening is always good. In fact, it's necessary. But what I'd really like to take away is what to do about it. Mm-hmm. So if you have any ideas about what to do about the divide, I'd love to hear them.
Sure. So, would a show of hands help? Just how many of you consider yourself to be from a rural community? Yeah, I think that makes, yeah. So, yeah, when I convey, I think I tend to talk from my own perspective, right? Which, honestly, when I started this work, I thought I was from small town Wisconsin. Grafton, compared to the teams, for example, that we would compete against in school sports, was small, lower income, but I got schooled on that pretty quickly, right? When I started to actually go to small towns. Grafton had a population of 7,000 when I was growing up, right? And was technically in the Milwaukee metro area, even though most of the people I had grown up with had never been to Milwaukee, and their families didn't plan to go to Milwaukee. It's a different place now than it was then. What to do about it? I mean, a variety of things, everything from our own everyday interactions to what we demand of our public officials. But the listening is, I see it as both just an ethic of how we are with people in our lives, in our workplaces, in our classes, building in, and we have to be intentional about building in time to pause and hear other people and reflect on it, because the tide is in the other direction, right? Just social media in particular is not about listening to other people. But we also need to demand it of the people who represent us, or be courageous and run for office ourselves and use an ethic of listening as we're representing other people. So I think we have to actively try to do it. And there's a whole other conversation we can have about when should we stop listening and speak up, right? When is that required? But thank you for the questions.
Yeah, other questions? Travis?
So one thing I'm somewhat curious about is whether you heard people talking about fear very much, because one thing that I often hear is that it seems like urban and rural people are kind of mutually fearful of each other, and people are afraid of going to the city if they live in a rural environment. And conversely, I also hear that a lot, that people in an urban environment are kind of afraid of small town or rural areas. But maybe, I don't know if that's a pattern you saw, or if you have any thoughts on that or not.
I did hear that a bit. I mean, I did hear people talking about worrying about crime in coming to Madison or Milwaukee. I also heard people in Milwaukee, particularly I'm thinking of a conversation among a group of Black people in a Black Baptist church on the north side of Milwaukee, talking about being afraid to drive up to Fond du Lac, to be honest, and be out on the road after dark, which those are conversations I was not familiar with myself. So I would have to say, before 2016, I did not hear white folks in the cities expressing fear about going into more rural parts of the state. I think that kind of fear has ramped up with all the hype about how divided we are and how much we hate each other. I think it's overblown, obviously. Yeah, fear doesn't help, right? Because it raises our assumptions about the worst in each other.
Yes.
Could you address how you overcame the implicit bias? You walk into a gas station, a diner, and 5 or 7 white males of 57 age, they're not going to accept you, and they may let you sit there for a bit, but you're not going to get an honest conversation, I don't think. So I guess the question is methodology.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to know, like I'll never know if they were honest or not, right? But this is the way it went. So usually, like I said, people would look surprised and look at me like I was a little bit nuts. But mind you, when I started, right, I did not walk in with a demeanor of they're going to throw me out, they're going to be mean to me. I'm generally a shy person, and so it took a little bit of gumption to just interrupt a conversation. But after a short amount of time, say 10, 15 minutes, when they realized I really was there to just listen as much as possible. I wasn't running for office. I wasn't trying to sell them anything. I wasn't going to persuade them of anything. I wasn't going to tell them that they were wrong. My sense is people really started to talk. So, for example, I remember vividly a conversation in Green Bay, actually, at a diner. I walked in, and the fellas having breakfast together said to me, okay, you can sit down for a few minutes, but you cannot turn your recorder on. And then 45 minutes later, they were saying, you have to stay. Tim shows up at 8 o'clock. You have to stay. Like, how can you leave? So there were probably times people were very guarded and didn't say a lot to me. But I get actually an important part of the story I'm forgetting is when I showed up 6 months later again, they were surprised, right? And sometimes they would say that to me, oh, you came back, And when I'd show up a year later, like a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time, the third time especially, people started saying things like, you're really serious about this. Like you actually want to understand what's going on here. And so again, I don't know if they were being honest,
shows
but...
up on the second, third time. That's when the validity begins they see it then.
Well, on my first visit even, they're not holding back about their attitudes about UW-Madison, for example, right? Even though I've given them my card, I've said I'm a political scientist at UW-Madison. I don't think people sold me a bill of goods. And in part because of the way they went deeper into their thoughts the second, third time, and because of the way I heard such similar things across these 27 different communities. So, we all adjust what we say given whom we're talking with, but I think people were pretty open with me.
Did the recorder to many people?
It upset one person that I remember, but honestly, I think it was more useful as a reminder that she's not just a visitor, she's here to do a thing, like whatever we call it, research or listening or getting to know us. So some people were uncomfortable with it. Most of the time it didn't seem to be the case. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, a question in the back.
So for the county that I live in, the local newspaper doesn't really report on politics because both sides are so polarized that they just don't want to talk about it. And even despite just the lack of stuff to report on, they still don't kind of mention a lot of the political topics that might be occurring. So do you think that's something that might just be an irregularity for where I live, or is that a common sentiment shared by newspapers in rural communities?
Yeah, I think it's common. What county are you from?
Sheriff County?
Okay, yeah. It's very common, increasingly so, in Wisconsin, but across the country as well. Just local newspapers are a dying breed, unfortunately. There's just very little print, even print online coverage of local and state politics, right? Sometimes there's a local talk radio show that somewhat fills in the gap, but it's not exclusive to Waushara.
Subscribe to the Commonwealth.
There you
Keep it
go.
going.
And so it's not just an avoidance of politics, it's just there aren't the resources to actually cover it.
But do you think there's also the concern of offending people because you don't want to lose half of your subscribers?
Yeah, it could be, and the papers that are left, yeah, the business model is not such that being, you want people to pick up the paper. Basically, you want to cover weather, local sports, and local kind of events, right? Because that's what people feel good about.
Yeah, thank you, President, for the question. Other questions, Caitlin?
When you were conducting your research, did you find that certain age groups, either from rural or urban communities, were they talking about the same things as compared to like a different age group where they were talking about the same thing? And if so, what kind of topics were they talking about?
It's such a good question. I don't know much about people in their 20s and 30s. And so I spent time with 4-H groups and listened to really younger people, but the 20s and 30s, honestly, I had a hard time finding groups of people that I could just walk into and spend time with because typically they're busy with young families or working. And you know, when I would ask people, where should I go in such and such Wisconsin to find people in their 20s and 30s, and they'd look at me like, did you really grow up in Wisconsin? Like, you go to the tavern, right? But I sort of chickened out because there were times when I remember one, well, I can tell you the community because I didn't end up actually spending time with people. In Siren, Wisconsin, I pulled up to this adorable looking bar and parked my Volkswagen Jetta in this row of pickup trucks, and I'm about to walk into a bar, and I thought to myself, how are you going to do this? Like, if it's a diner, if it's a gas station, I can walk in and say, hi, I'm Kathy from the university, do you mind if I sit down and join you? I'm not going to walk in as a single woman and say, hi, I'm Kathy, do you mind if I sit down and join you for the evening? I chickened out, and I probably didn't need to in retrospect, and I wish that I hadn't, but there's so much more to learn. And definitely what I know from other studies, the concerns among younger people are different. Some of them are very much the same, similar economic, like there's concerns about the economy, but not so much, about their own employment and lack of say in their workplace, as opposed to people in retirement wishing that their kids could still live in the community so they could have time with their grandkids, right? There are some differences, yeah.
Just a question, was your question more focused on the age groups, or were you also interested in just like how much attention do certain topics maybe get in those rural conversations? I mean, you talked about the cost of healthcare or the lack of jobs in the rural areas. I don't know if you wanted to go in that direction as well, but.
Well, it could have gone both ways because I know just depending on certain studies, I think that urban citizens and rural citizens sometimes can have like different beliefs and all of that, which could lead to this, different topics about just certain things just depending on the age group. But then there's also times where beliefs and topics from both urban and rural communities can also be the same depending on the subject that they're talking about. So I was just curious if there was just any correlating interests between any age group, between your rural and urban communities that were similar and different.
I don't know, were there certain topics that stood out to you that maybe you were going into this and I had no idea how much they care about X, Y, and Z?
Well, I would say in listening I've done since this project of driving around the state, just listening through other means, whether it's there was recently a national sample, like a nationally representative sample done of in-depth interviews of people of you know, all kinds of income backgrounds and age backgrounds. And one thing that really surprised me in that was the similarity in people, regardless of the type of community that they live in, and accessing government support, government programs, whether it's figuring out how to get a certification for a certain type of employment, to accessing like welfare benefits, or in taking advantage of certain scholarships for kids in school. Like, there's many people struggle to connect with their government in ways that will be helpful to them, and that's maybe across generation and across place too. But there are a variety of things. It's a great question.
Dan.
Last 3 elections with Biden and Kresge and Evers, the state went left Democratic. The assembly is predominantly Republican and will stay that way because of this issue that went to the Supreme Court on redistricting or /gerrymandering. Do you think there'd be less polarization if these districts were reshaped to where they were to be even, because the vote disparity is significant across the whole state, but yet it's favoring Republicans, okay? Do you think that would make a difference in how people view issues and favoritism throughout the state?
I do think so. It would take some time, I think, but if our districts were more competitive, there wouldn't be an incentive for the primaries to elect candidates who are more extreme than the average voter in that district, right? There would be an incentive instead to appeal to a broader range of people, as opposed to people who are just lean toward the party that you're from as a candidate. And again, I think it would take some time for that to really seep into the culture of a place, but it would help. I think it would help a lot.
Michelle.
What kind of questions did you get in rural America? You listened a lot, but did people ask you questions?
Sure. Sure, great question.
Just for the sound, the question is about what questions did you get?
Yeah. Such a variety of things. I mean, from someone asking me about how the, and I think this is too personal to relay, but sort of a question about how a certain thing was done in Madison that I didn't have a personal connection with, but it was a father wondering about how his daughter had been harmed and what's going on in Madison to help him try to understand. To things about the university, to things about state government, sort of, because I was of Madison, many people asked me questions about institutions, their state institutions, kind of seeing me as a representative, right? But then sometimes people had questions about politics in general, especially after they got to know me and know what I studied. But maybe the most interesting question I got was, what are you hearing in other places? Which was taught me so much about how little we know about each other and how little chance we have to learn about what's actually going on in the lives of other people in the state. And you might think, well, but we have Facebook, right? Or other forms of social media. Aren't people getting it that way? Not really, right? And that kind of question actually was part of an incentive to create a kind of human tech platform of public conversation that I've been working on with a lab at MIT to try to enable people to be heard and to listen in on communities that they don't have physical access to, but are curious about what's going on in other people's lives.
Angie.
So do you think social media has diminished or like fueled the polarity of like people living in rural and urban communities?
The question is about what's the role of social media.
Yeah, I do think it has fueled polarity. I mean, it doesn't have to. I can imagine certain kinds of platforms that actually diminish polarity, but because of the way most of these platforms are constructed, they earn money by drawing us in, right? And by incentivizing posting things that draw other people's attention. And unfortunately, a big draw is like divisive, kind of somewhat extreme, provocative messages, right? And so it doesn't help currently. I'm holding out hope though.
Marty.
I think the urban-rural split is even more sharply drawn than you might have implied. And I can't speak about way up north, you know, that is, you know, different for sure. But around here, just take the most recent Supreme Court election. Janet Protasiewicz carried the city of Ripon, and that's not new. It's Barack Obama carried Ripon twice, Bill Clinton once. And by the margin, it was a statewide margin, 55 to 44 or 45. She also carried the city of Fond du Lac. She carried the so-called village of North Fond du Lac. So all these urban areas are voting Democrat, at least in that case, and in earlier cases. But then the rural areas just outside of town. These aren't alien people. These are people we rub elbows with. Half those people work at Speed Queen, or they work at an industry here, or Mercury Marine. So they're not an alien species, but they're voting for the Dan Kelly by 80% to 20%. So how can you have people that are in such close proximity with such completely different worldviews and voting behavior?
Great question. Great question. Yeah, I mean, what do you think? How do you, I mean...
I think a lot of it is, in my own humble opinion, frankly, I am a political scientist as well, but I think it is what you talked about, a certain identity, and then listening, you know, being in a bubble, being in a propaganda bubble or a media bubble where I only hear what portrays me as a victim. By the way, a lot of those farmers, and you can say that family farms are victimized, but in some cases it is true, but actually the consolidation of farmland is being carried out by families. And certain families are just getting bigger and bigger, and others are leaving. But these are farms that were family farms that are now, you know, 600 acres, 800 acres, you know, 1,000 cows and so forth. And if you look at the income, it's extremely high. And then you look at
all the hours it takes to take care of all that.
Yes, and believe me, I grew up in a farming background, ma'am. I grew up with that. I did it myself. I know what you're talking about. But I also know who's milking the cows at the 1,000 cow farms, and it's not the owner. It's not the owner's kids. It's actually migrants. And then they vote for the anti-immigrant candidates. So that is the reality.
Well, I think part of what goes on, to go back to identity, that it's not just that people are voting for a certain candidate or for a certain side, but they're voting against certain candidates or certain sides who they perceive don't hear them or shout them down when they do try to make their voices heard. And I think that happens on both sides. So it's because honestly, in my experience, when I ask people, which party do you think best represents people around here? Most of the time, what I heard, and pretty quickly, was neither. Right? Neither party's listening to people like me. And so it's as much a antipathy to a side that doesn't seem to get what's going on for me and my family as an attraction to a certain side.
Cass.
Would I have your permission to make a comment instead of asking a question?
Please, yeah, sure.
So I do a lot of canvassing. I've done a lot of canvassing for many years, and most recently for myself. And that was the best experience of all. I like canvassing. I like just talking to random people. But doing it for myself was the first time I had talked to a majority of Republicans and independents. And I went outside of Ripon, which I had never done before. I'd always canvassed in the city of Ripon. And I went out to the rural areas. And I loved it. I mean, I loved the conversations I had. I loved that I was invited in. And I'm saying this partly because those of you who don't know what to do but want to do something, canvass. And don't just canvass for your own party. And I remember one of my first conversations was with an old guy who clearly was not going to be favorable to me if I came on strong as a Democrat. But I just wanted to know, what are you concerned about? What do you care about? And we talked for a long time about his septic system, which was leaking, and he was supposed to get it fixed, and he didn't have the money to do that, and he was afraid some regulator was going to come down on him. And I did some research to find out what was going to happen and was there a fund to help him out. But after a half-hour conversation, as I was leaving, he kind of growled and he patted me on the back and he said, "I wish you were a Republican." And that kind of connection, it happens all the time when you bother to go out there and talk to people.
Yeah, that's so great to hear. And so resonates with me so strongly because the number of times people said things to me like, after, especially second, third visit, you're the first professor I've ever met, and you're actually kind of normal. And I would love to hear just a few more sentences on what, it's pretty clear to me, but what you loved about that canvassing.
What I loved about it was the sense that you can find a connection. It was extremely rare that we didn't find a connection. And I would begin my conversation with, well, I'm knocking on doors today. I'm, depending on what I'm running for the county board, and I'm wondering, if you have any thoughts about the county board, what the county does, any thoughts about county issues. And most people didn't know anything about county issues because it's not covered in the paper anywhere. It's not anybody's bailiwick. So I would tell them a few things like, these are some of the things that counties do.
It is now because of your column.
Thank you. So
she had a column in the Commonwealth.
But people would always have an opinion about roads. If I mentioned that, people would have something to say. But we would find some little thing that we had in common. We'd sort of fish around and we'd find that thing, and then we'd build out from there, and there'd be this whole network of things that we could talk about. And I will say that most of my conversations when I was canvassing on the outskirts of Ripon and outside of Ripon lasted 20 to 30 minutes. Most of them.
Awesome. That's the kind of thing that gives me hope, right? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. When people have the opportunity just to connect, to spend a little time talking with each other and what they care about, it happens. It's awesome. Thank you.
There's a question from former Senator Luther Olson.
You didn't have to say that.
That's okay. I knew who you were.
Appreciate you being here. As I'm listening to what you're saying, and you've been giving speeches and talks all over the place, I really believe what you're saying in your research about Wisconsin can fit all of the West states. We are not unique. This is the way it is pretty much in the Midwest. You look at some of the states that don't have difference in the way the rural people think here, I think is exactly the way they think in Iowa and Minnesota and Nebraska and Illinois. If you done enough and talked to enough people that you sort of could say, yeah, that's pretty much the way the world is.
I think that's right. I mean, it's been my experience in the upper Midwest, like Michigan, even New York State somewhat. I mean, especially in these states where there is such a population concentration, right? And it's so different than, say, the Eastern Seaboard where there's rural areas, but they're not, the employment is different because the commutes are easier if you want to work in a city, right, for example. But yeah, I think we're not unique, and this divide in understanding is pretty common. And I think it's a little bit different, but it's in every part of the country.
And the reason I ask that question is people say, well, how do you change it? You're not going to change Wisconsin. It's just the way the world is. Rural people, and I used to represent rural people. I didn't represent too many urban areas. And honestly, politicians and legislatures reflect their community. You know, people say, oh, you're not reflecting this. Damn right they are. They're reflecting you because you don't get elected. And I know what happens when you veer too much to where they're not at. They call you up pretty short to make sure that, you know what, we elect you to do, and this is what we want you to do, and by darn, you better be doing it. And so when we say, well, they go to Madison or Washington and do their own thing, now they're representing you because those are the people who elected you, and you have to be really beholden to them. And if you're going to be beholden to somebody else, you're not going to get reelected. So I just think that saying, well, you know, they go off and do their own thing, I don't think so.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions, but really brief questions, hopefully, and pretty brief answers if possible. Aaron?
Okay. Do you think that there is a way for there to be a positive economic vision that unites the city and rural voters and overcomes culture war issues?
Oh, that's a great question.
Briefly?
That was my... I wanted to, actually, that was kind of almost my last question for you, because I wanted to end on the message of kind of hope and, you know, hopefully, you know, sort of, yeah, what is, you know, and we can look at the issue of like onshoring, right, and we're moving away from those from China and East Asia, and, you know, is this something that can kind of help us sort of bridge the rural divide, for example?
Well, I'll try to be brief in that I think there is hope in that when you listen to people across rural and urban areas, and I mean partly this project I've been talking about, but then subsequent things, including a commission that I'm co-chairing called Reimagining Our Economy for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is about these questions. How do we, I'm making it too long. When you listen across different types of places, there are similarities in people's concerns. Like, people just want sufficiency, right? They want enough to be able to spend time with their families, to be healthy, to earn what they need in a meaningful way, in a job that doesn't crush their soul. And so there has to be policy solutions that address those things that we can then sort of more publicly acknowledge. Look at how all of us need certain types of things, certain policies in place. Bridging the culture war, I think, is harder. I don't have a quick answer for that one, but thank you for the question.
And there's a question over here.
I have a comment,
Oh.
and I'll make it quick. So I think this is fascinating, no matter what side you're on, and I appreciate all the work that you've done, just to get the conversation going. I think like Kathy said, she did a lot of listening. I think it's good to, especially hear things that maybe you don't always agree with. And it's okay. I think it's also good not to think that that person is wrong, or or get mad. I'll just give one example. My partner and I live on a golf course around here, and we have the cart path right next to our house. And the guy that's in charge of blowing the leaves on the golf course, he would kind of help us with our leaves in our yard. One day he saw we put up a political sign, and he didn't agree with the political sign, so he said, you know, I just don't know if I'm gonna help anymore with blowing the leaves. And I said, you know, the thing is, we can disagree and we can still get along. And he said, I wasn't expecting that. And he's helped ever since. You know, I mean, that's all that's said about it. That is fine, that he thinks differently. But there's just such this, you are bad if you believe in this. We all have our own way of thinking, and it's very complex. So just, like when you said, at human level, if you can connect with people on a human level, get rid of all the other stuff. When you strip it all down, we're all human. That's it. So that's all I have to say.
That was beautifully said. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's certainly always a good idea to break out of our echo chambers as much as possible. Sorry, I did forget or not miss one question earlier. There's one question here, yeah.
So this idea, just kind of thinking a lot, I struggle to frame a question. This idea of state autonomy and state sovereignty, I'm guessing kind of the theme, or maybe if there was any commentary in these rural communities that you visited, you know, their sentiments are, we don't like the urban policies coming to rural settings in the same way you see on a national level. You see people migrating from California to Texas, and people in Texas being very standoffish, as well as some of the red states in the northern region of the country, North Dakota, South Dakota, some of those, Idaho, you know, they are very standoffish to non-residents migrating there and enacting their policies. Did any of that kind of come up in your dialogue over that time frame?
On a real micro level around public school teachers. Right, so and I've experienced this in my own family. Both my parents were public school teachers, but and I lived in Grafton all my life except the first 40 years. But even still, my parents they're not from there, right? Even though they've lived there 50 years. And I encountered that in other communities where, you know, even if people had grown up 20 miles away, they talked about how they're, oh, I'm not from here, I'm from 20 miles down the road, and there's such strong attachment to community. What to make of that? It's both a beautiful thing. People are like, you know, I'm from here, and it's also, it's unfortunate that we can be so exclusive at times.
All right, we have to come to an end here. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you for your questions, thoughtful questions, very thoughtful comments. This is our last event of the year, and I want us to thank Kathy for coming tonight.